We're going to take a look now at a picture of the Beatles in 1960. John Lennon, George Harrison, and Paul McCartney, of course, are easily recognized, but the fourth member of the group doesn't really look much like Ringo Starr, and that, of course, is because he is not. He is Pete Best. He was the original drummer in this group until he was bumped for Ringo. That took place in 1962. He is now out of the music business and is making a special appearance here tonight. We're pleased to welcome Mr. Pete Best, ladies and gentlemen.
One might assume the original drummer of the world's most iconic band would be enjoying a life of unparalleled luxury. But for Pete Best, the reality was shockingly different. He was the man on the drum throne for the Beatles during their formative years, the handsome face on the posters, the steady beat in the sweaty clubs of Hamburg and Liverpool. He was there on the very brink of global stardom, only to be cast aside brutally just as the rocket was about to launch. Join us as we reveal the conflicting stories, the whispered jealousies, and the one professional opinion that gave the Beatles the excuse they needed to change history forever. The Accidental Beatle. In the summer of 1960, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison faced a career-defining opportunity and a massive problem. They had secured a residency to play in the rough-and-tumble clubs of Hamburg, Germany, a crucial step for any aspiring rock and roll band. But the club owner demanded a 5-piece group, and they were missing a permanent drummer. Their ambition was about to be thwarted by a simple lack of rhythm. The solution, it turned out, was living just a few miles away. Pete Best wasn't just a drummer, he was the son of Mona Best, a visionary entrepreneur who had turned the cellar of her family home into the Casbah Coffee Club, one of the first and most important venues for Liverpool's burgeoning music scene. The Quarrymen, the Beatles' earlier incarnation, had even helped paint the walls and played some of their first gigs there. With time running out before their trip to Hamburg, Paul McCartney made a fateful phone call. Pete, who had his own successful local band, the Blackjacks, was considering a stable career in teaching and was offered the gig. He auditioned the next day, and within minutes he was in. From the band's perspective, the decision was purely pragmatic. As John Lennon later admitted, the primary criteria for hiring Best was that he owned a drum kit and was available to travel. In those early days, the shared dream of fame and fortune was an intoxicating bond. Pete was fully invested, a believer in their collective potential. He would later recall the electric sense of optimism that powered them through those grueling early shows. Quote, "Where are we going, guys? Straight to the top." Little did he know that his position, secured out of necessity, was far more precarious than he could have imagined. The Hamburg Crucible and King of the Cavern. The years between 1960 and 62 were a trial by fire. The grueling schedule in Hamburg, playing for hours on end every night, transformed the Beatles from a raw teenage band into a tight powerhouse live act. Back home in Liverpool, they became the undisputed kings of the Cavern Club. And at the center of the screaming crowds was Pete Best. While the other Beatles had their own appeal, Pete was the band's first heartthrob. Dark, brooding, and handsome, he was consistently the most popular member with their burgeoning female fan base. The adoration was so intense that during one show in Manchester, a fan lunged at him with scissors to get a piece of his shirt, accidentally cutting him. When he returned to the tour bus, shaken, he was reportedly lectured for showing up the boys. Musically, he was more than a placeholder. He developed a powerful, driving style known as the atom beat, a heavy four-to-the-bar bass drum rhythm that became a signature of their early sound and was copied by other drummers on the Mersey beat scene. To the fans packing the Cavern, Pete Best was an essential part of the magic. But behind the scenes, a different story was unfolding. While Pete enjoyed a level of individual popularity the others didn't, it may have inadvertently developed a growing chasm. He was described as quiet and sullen, often keeping to himself after gigs instead of joining in the razor-sharp banter and camaraderie that bonded John, Paul, and George. A powerful visual symbol of this separation was his refusal to adopt the iconic mop-top haircut that would soon define the band's image. The truth was far more brutal. While fans chanted his name, the other Beatles were already plotting his exit. The core trio's bond was forged over the years of shared history and humor, and Pete remained an outsider. Years later, John Lennon would reveal the cold, premeditated reality of their mindset. Quote, "By then, we were pretty sick of Pete Best, too, because he was a lousy drummer, he never improved. We were always going to dump him when we could find a decent drummer." The Whisper Campaign and Producers' Push. The final act of Pete Best's Beatles career began June 6, 1962, at Abbey Road Studios in London. The band had secured an audition with Parlophone Records producer George Martin, a sophisticated, classically trained musician who represented their last best hope for a record deal. Martin listened to their raw rock and roll and saw potential. He liked the energy, the charisma, and their original songs, but he had reservations about the drumming. In his professional opinion, Best's playing wasn't solid enough for studio work. Quote, "I decided that the drums, the backbone of a good rock group, didn't give the boys enough support," Martin later said. He informed the band's manager, Brian Epstein, that while they could keep Best for live performances, he intended to use a session drummer for recordings. This is the moment the official story was born, the clean, professional reason for what came next. But the reality is murkier. George Martin was adamant for the rest of his life he never suggested Best should be fired. In fact, he was shocked when he learned they'd let him go, stating, quote, "I never thought that Brian Epstein would let him go. He seemed to be the most saleable commodity as far as looks went." The use of a session drummer was a common industry practice at the time and didn't necessitate firing a band member. For John, Paul, and George, Martin's technical critique was not a problem to be solved, it was the perfect opportunity. It was the unimpeachable professional justification they needed to execute a decision they privately had wanted to make for months. The execution was swift and cowardly. Rather than face the man they had shared stages and cramped vans with for 2 years, they delegated the dirty work to Brian Epstein. On August 16, 1962, Best was summoned to Epstein's office. He walked in expecting to discuss future gigs. Instead, his world fell apart. The manager, visibly agitated, paced the room before delivering the devastating news. Pete recalled the moment with the clarity of a traumatic memory. Quote, "He said, in a nutshell, the boys want you out and they want Ringo Starr in. Well, I was completely shell-shocked by this. I couldn't sort of get my mind together or whatever." In that sterile office, the dream died. The reasons given were vague, but Pete himself would later conclude that the root cause was simple jealousy. The band, however, now had their official story, courtesy of George Martin. The betrayal and long road back. The dismissal was more than a firing, it was an excommunication. Pete Best felt a profound sense of betrayal, not just from the bandmates he considered friends, but also from his replacement, Ringo Starr, whom he'd also considered a pal. While the Beatles, with Ringo now in tow, recorded Love Me Do and were launched into the stratosphere of global fame, Pete's life began to unravel. He tried to stay in the music business, fronting the Pete Best combo, but the shadow of his former band was inescapable. He watched from the sidelines, as the four men he once stood beside became the most famous people on the planet. The psychological toll was immense. By 1968, he had quit music entirely, at one point working in a bread factory to support his young family. The despair deepened, culminating in a suicide attempt from which he was saved by his mother and brother. For the next 2 decades, Pete lived a life of quiet anonymity as a civil servant, the man who was almost a Beatle, a distant memory. He had been written out of the story. But in a twist of fate, the very institution that cast him out was the source of his ultimate ironic redemption. In 1995, the surviving Beatles released the Beatles Anthology 1, a compilation of early recordings and outtakes. To tell their origin story accurately, they had to include tracks from their Hamburg days and early auditions, tracks that featured Pete on drums. His inclusion was a matter of historical necessity for them, but for him it was life-changing. For his contributions, he was entitled to royalties, a sum estimated to be between $1.3 and $5.2 million. After decades of struggle, he was finally financially secure, a millionaire thanks to the band that had fired him. The windfall provided more than money, it was a form of closure. His contribution, long dismissed, was now part of the official multi-platinum selling record. Years later, Paul McCartney reflected on the brutal decision. Quote, "And I do feel sorry for him because of what he could have been onto, but as far as we were concerned, it was strictly a professional decision. If he wasn't up to the mark, then there was no choice." Now it's time to hear from you. What was the most surprising part of this story? Let us know in the comments section below.